In this lecture, we'll direct our attention to Proverbs chapter 5, verses 1 through 23. As you can see from the display before you, this constitutes poem 4, which is the last in the first cycle. First cycle includes poem 2 that begins chapter 4, verse 10, poem 3 that begins chapter 4, verse 20, and now we concentrate on poem 4, beginning chapter 5, verse 1. Again, by way of review, the reason we group those three together is because through those three, we have a sampling of each of three themes. Theme A concentrated on reprimand, a situation where the youth is clearly in the wrong and the sage holds him accountable for that and redirects him. Theme B is a poem where we find concentrated language about the physical body, whether literal or metaphoric. The issue is rather that it's about the physical body. And then theme C is a poem where we find the sage concentrating on influential women. In the case of poem 4 here in Proverbs 5, we have both positive women and negative women presented. The title that I would suggest for poem 4, that is Proverbs 5, is this: Avoid the enslaving foreign woman. Delight in your wife and find fruitfulness. This lecture responds to the youth's implicit question, namely, why so much fuss about getting off the wrong road and getting on the right road? I see no hazard on the horizon. In answer, the grandfather explains that the youth will find himself drawn to two opposing women. By understanding the consequences associated with each woman, the youth will be able to choose wisely and so can avoid fatal entrapment. Let's consider the position of this poem within the context of the book of Proverbs. First, the preceding context. After the grandfather opened his legacy wisdom with an urgent call to, above all else, acquire wisdom, that was poem 1, spanning Proverbs 4, 1 through 9. He then issued his first wisdom content lesson by jolting the youth with a reprimand that was calculated to dislodge him from his present hazardous route of travel. That was poem 2, following what we're identifying as theme A, that is reprimand. It spanned Proverbs 4, starting with verse 10 and encompassing verse 19. With the youth thus removed from the wrong route, assuming that he takes to heart the reprimand, the sage then proceeded to show that traveling the correct wisdom way would call for specific body behavior, including eyes, ears, and feet. That's poem 3, tracking with theme B, body behavior, beginning in chapter 4:20 through 4:27. The importance of traveling that wisdom way grows transparently clear once one realizes the pain that follows succumbing to the enslaving foreign woman's allurements. And that is poem number 4, where we are right now, theme C. It's helpful to notice that a trio of travel-related terms that occurs in the conclusion of poem 4 already appeared toward the close of poem 3. Those terms are pave, track, and ways. They occurred in chapter 4:26, and in the current poem they will show up in 5:20. Recurrence of this trio indicates a continuity beginning in poem 3 and continuing now to the end of poem 4. What about the ensuing context? Following the completion of this poem 4, as it wraps up cycle 1 with its 3 themes, that is, reprimand, body behavior, and now influential woman. Poem 5 next will revisit that first theme of the trio, namely reprimand. There in Poem 5, the sage will challenge the youth to escape a snare of an economic sort, a contrast to the amorous sort of snare that we find here in poem number 4. Let's read through this poem, starting with chapter 5, verse 1. My son, pay attention to my wisdom. To understanding turn your ear, in order to guard forethought, and so that your lips may protect knowledge. For a dripping honeycomb is a foreign woman's lips, and her mouth is more slippery than oil. Her final outcome is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a double-edged sword. Her feet are death descenders. It is Sheol that her steps will take hold of, lest she might pave a path to life. Her tracks roamed about, she remains unknowing. So now, sons, listen to me. Do not turn away from my words. Keep your way a good distance from her, and do not approach the door of her house, lest you give over to outsiders your splendor, and your years to the cruel, lest foreigners eat their fill of your exertion, and of your hard toil in a stranger's house, so that you will groan in your last days as your flesh and body waste away. Then you will say, how deeply I hated discipline, and my mind spurned reproof. And I would not obey my teachers, and toward my instructors I would not turn my ears. In no time at all I was totally ruined amid the congregation and the assembly. Drink water from your cistern and rivulets from your well. May your springs overflow outside. In the plazas, channels of water. May they belong to you alone and not to strangers near you. May your fountain be blessed and rejoice because of the wife from your youth. An affectionate fawn and a gentle doe are her breasts. May they quench your thirst at all times. On account of her love, you should continually stagger. So why, my son, should you stagger on account of a foreign woman, or embrace a stranger woman's bosom? If a person's ways are straight before the Lord's eyes, he paves all his tracks. His misdeeds will trap the guilty, and in the snares of his sin he will be held fast. He will die for lack of discipline, and due to his widespread foolishness, he will stagger. The poem spanning Proverbs 5 consists of 4 sections. With a summons, the grandfather sage opens the lecture, seeding the concepts of foresight and lips. That's in section 1, which occupies simply the first 2 verses of chapter 5. Then follows a description of the danger that will confront the youth, namely a strategy of deadly seduction by a character that's known as the foreign woman. That's section 2, spanning verses 3 through 6. To withstand her stratagems, the sage presents 2 defenses against danger, the first negative and the second positive. Those occupy section 3, blocks B and C. Block B is verses 8 to 14, block C verses 15 through 20. A character summary draws the poem to a close in section 4. That's verses 21 through 23. As we move now to look at the macro and micro structural features, we'll be distinguishing between those that arise from form over against those that arise from content. A word of explanation may be helpful. A feature that arises from form, such as repetition of a specific Hebrew word, that feature would be recognizable. It would be operative regardless of the meaning of that particular word. For a feature instead to arise from content, we actually have to pay attention to the meaning of the word. Again, form would be equivalent to just having a color or a line there. It doesn't have meaning, but you can see that that color recurs in a couple places, like a red line. You would then connect all the portions that are marked in red and say these may be connected, although you don't have any meaning for the red line. That's what we mean by a feature arising from form. Recurrence of a particular word, a signal, to which we don't have to tune into the theme which it's presenting, just the recurrence of that particular word. Content, again, requires us to pay attention to the meaning, and that enables us to link one word with a synonym because we're tapping into an underlying common meaning. Let's look first at macro structural features. Again, those are features which connect from one section to another section. Form accounts for three structures that span more than one section. They include one instance of reversal and two cases of repetition that contribute to closure. First, consider reversal involving the word lips in sections 1 and 2. In section 1, the word lips designates that part of the youth that he must activate, putting it to work to protect knowledge. That's chapter 5, verse 2. Lips appears again in the very next verse, but with a reversal. Now the term refers not to the lips of the youth, but to those of the foreign woman. The first occurrence closed section 1. The second occurrence opens section 2. There in section 2, lips lead the list of allurements that this foreign woman employs to entrap the youth. Through this reversal, the pupil realizes how strategic it is for his lips to protect knowledge so that he may be able to withstand the hazardous woman's wiles. Next, consider closure involving pave and take hold of, terms that occur both in sections 2 and 4. Closure in section 4 arises in part from the reuse of the word pave and the expression take hold of. In section 2, the hazardous woman's steps take hold of Sheol. That shows up in verse 5. While in verse 22, the guilty by his sinful snares will be held fast, that is, captured. That occurs in section 4. In section 2, the foreign woman will not pave a path to life. That's chapter 5, verse 6. While in section 4, we learn that the Lord paves the tracks of the ethical person. That's verse 21. These occurrences of the expression to pave recall an imperative using the very same verb in the previous lecture. Chapter 4, verse 26a reads, "Pave the track for your feet." This suggests a certain continuity, even extending from the preceding lecture. Finally, consider closure involving the expression to stagger that occurs in section 3 and then culminates in section 4. Twice in section 3, the sage uses the expression to stagger in order to describe the euphoria of amorous love, whether licit, that is, legitimate, in verse 19 or illicit in verse 20. Then, when in section 4 he closes the entire lecture by describing the fool as staggering, he effects a closural link reaching back to section 3. However, this time in verse 23, stagger refers to hazardously losing one's footing, not being drunk with euphoric love. Now let's consider content-based macrostructures. Content accounts for two structures at the macro level. They involve theme and progression of thought. First, consider theme, especially the theme of foresight that appears in sections 1 and 2. The retrospective hypothetical confession that we find in verses 11 to 14 reinforces how needful was the capacity for foresight if the youth is to be able to detect and avoid the foreign woman's seductions. Foresight would have been safeguarded, we're looking now at verse 2a, if only the youth had paid attention to wisdom and turned his ear to understanding. Verse 1. Next, consider the progression of thought between sections 2, 3, and 4. Sections 2, that is verses 3 through 6, and 4, that is verses 21, 2, and 3, contribute parallel components in the logical progression of this lecture's persuasive thought. Here's what we mean. Both section 2 and section 4 supply information that gives incentive, supporting the initial imperative. That is, the imperative found in the summons calling the youth to pay close attention to wisdom. That was section 1, verses 1 and 2. Both incentives found in sections 2 and 4 begin with a Hebrew particle ki. In verse 3, that's rendered for. In the expression, for a dripping honeycomb is a foreign woman's lips. It's rendered if in verse 21, where we read, if a person's ways are straight before the Lord's eyes. So the word for and the word if both trace back to the same Hebrew word, which is pronounced ki. Although this is an extremely common Hebrew particle, within all of Proverbs 5, the word ki occurs only at the initiation of these two sections, section 2 and section 4, thereby increasing the likelihood that these operate as intentional structural signals. Even the choice in verse 21 to express if with the Hebrew word ki, rather than a more customary word for if, that's the Hebrew word im, this fits the structural arrangement of this poem. One difference distinguishes section 4 from section 2, however. While section 2 concentrates on negative information about the foreign woman, information calculated to disincline the youth from associating with her, section 4 supports the imperative that led off section 1 by mentioning the divine dimension. There in section 4, we read that the Lord both notes and rewards ethical conduct. That's verse 21. Between the incentive messages of sections 2 and 4, which we've just seen are joined by the particle ki, the sage shifts to content consisting of defensive strategies. That's section 3, spanning verses 7 through 20. The sage sets apart this section by disrupting the grandfather's lesson, breaking in with a secondary summons in the voice of the father sage. That's verse 7. A formal marker confirms this shift in content, namely a line initial adverbial disjunction in the expression so now. Thus verse 7 reads, So now, sons, listen to me. Do not turn away from my words. By virtue of the fact that he's addressing a plural audience, sons, we recognize this as being the second generation sage, the father, as opposed to his father, the grandfather sage, who issues legacy wisdom that began in chapter 4. And then, just to reinforce, that father sage breaks in with this disjunction, so now. And this is another marker of structure, helping us to recognize that at verse 7, a new section begins. These conclude the macrostructures. In the next portion of the lecture, we'll turn our attention to microstructural features.